Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Scott Sambucci here, and you are listening to another episode of the Go Farther series here on the Startup Selling Show. Scott Sambucci, the CEO, founder of Sales Qualia, and this is a continuation of our podcast series on the concept of go farther. How do you do more, be happy, and surprise yourself? It is Monday morning when I'm recording this, ready to rock and roll. I'm really excited about this because this topic today we're going to talk about is probably one of my favorites, which is called plan, prepare, visualize. Plan, prepare, visualize. So let's dig right in. As always, I've got a couple of examples from personal life and races, ultra marathons, all that good stuff that I do outside of my work life. And then we're going to talk about some examples in the work setting. And we're going to wrap up here with a couple of strategies to help you implement this concept of how do you improve on your planning, your preparation, your visualization? So, first of all, why is this important? Why is this important to think about this concept within Go Farther? Well, I think one, of course, we're all doing hard things. We're out there, whether it's building a business, trying to manage our family, do whatever things that you're doing outside of work, like me, whether it's ultra marathons or Brazilian jiu-jitsu or anything like that. And there's lots to balance. Some things that we're doing are very complicated. Many of the situations we find ourselves in are high leverage, high risk, high opportunity, whether it's meeting with investors or meeting with that next big customer that could be the next big logo for your startup. And of course, time is limited, right? So all of those things, factor into whenever we're trying to do that big thing or trying to reach that level of success that we want. And I think, at least for me, at the end of the day, I always kind of fear that I'm not going to turn that image or that visualization that I have in my mind into reality. I've heard it that when you're running a startup, that founders live in this reality distortion field, a reality distortion field where you're like literally trying to distort reality. You're trying to bend reality. You're trying to change the world around you to fit into this new model that hasn't existed before, meaning your business, your solution that you've built. So whether that's in the business life or your personal life, you're trying to do new things for yourself that haven't been done before, right? You're trying to distort reality and bend it into what you want it to be. So at least for me, when it comes to doing these hard things or doing these big things, there's kind of three things I always want to have going into any difficult endeavor, which is one, clarity. I want to have a clear sense of what I need to do in order to accomplish that thing, and clarity on what I'm going to do if things go a little bit off schedule or go off the tracks a little bit. Number two, I want to have a sense of control. I want to have that plan. I want to be prepared. I want to know that if I do these things, then I should be able to influence that outcome or distort the reality, the future reality around me. And thirdly, I want to have some confidence. Like I know when I'm prepared, when I've got a plan, when I feel like I've covered all of the details, then I've got a lot more confidence going into that hard thing that I'm doing, whether it's the next sales call, the next investor presentation, the next race, whatever it is. And at the end of the day, what that allows me to do, and what I think that allows us to do, if we follow these things, to have that clarity, that control, that confidence, it helps us to take advantage of opportunities that we've created for ourselves, right? And just basically execute on that plan and bring that visualization in our mind into realities. I will kind of preview this episode by telling you, like, I am a planner. I'm a mega planner. I am probably over the top planner, maybe to the point of what you might consider anal retentive. And it's just the way that I am. So I remember partly maybe this is part of upbringing. My dad was an accountant initially before he ran his own business for a little while. And when I was a kid, he used to always tell me, write it down, write it down. I'd say, forget something. He's like, I'll write it down. You got to write it down. Make a note to yourself, write it down. And he would have these checklists that he would constantly make for himself. Like if we were going to have one of the things my parents used to do a lot was have friends over at the house for different holidays or family. And my dad would be like, he would have a piece of paper. He would write down his checklist of all the food that we need to buy and the stores that he'd have to go to. And okay, we got to set up the tables and we got to like get the chairs out and we got to do this and we got to do that. I remember for my mom's 50th birthday, we had a surprise party for her. And he was so committed to making sure that this party was successful. He wrote out this like almost like a 10-page booklet down to every little detail that he gave to me because I was the one that was going to have to do a lot of the prep because he was getting my mom out of the house for dinner. And I still have this sheet. I've kept it all of these years because it's just kind of funny where it was even down to like he had me make numbered tags for coats. So my mom's birthday is in January and in New Jersey, it gets really cold. And so he told me to make numbered tags. So when people came in the house, I would take their coat, put it on a hanger and give them a number. So it would be easy to find their coats afterwards because we're having like, 30, 40 people at the house. So I think a lot of what I am like today comes from him and comes from my parents. So when it comes to planning for me, like a couple like time frames that I always think about and time frames that I'm always thinking about planning and preparing and mapping out what's going to happen is first the beginning of the year. So at the end of every year over the holiday, I usually take a bit of a break around the Christmas time, New Year's holiday, like a lot of people. And part of that is to look back and close out the year, close out the books, do everything I need to do with the business. It more so though, it's thinking about what's going to happen over the next year. And I've worked with a business coach for years named Taki Moore, and he introduced this concept of what he calls the pre-loaded year, the pre-loaded year. And so in the in-person workshops that he hosts for his clients, in the November workshop, it's about 3 times a year we run these workshops in person. We'd all fly to LA or come to San Francisco or whatever, kind of work on the businesses. And in the November workshop, we used to map out the year ahead and what he called the preloaded year. So it's always started with like, first of all, put in all of the vacations that you want to take or trips you're going to take or holidays, your time off, like that goes first. Get that in the holiday in your calendar. Then start working on your big events. Like if you're going to run workshops yourself, or you're going to go to certain events or conferences, or you're going to be doing big speaking gigs, get those into the calendar. And then from there, you start putting in other things that are going to be important to you, whether it's like for me, it's races that I'm going to be doing, or I think I'm going to be doing over the year ahead, or competitions. I'll put things down like I'll look at my son's school calendar, which is usually posted, and I'll make sure we've got the spring break week or any weeks where there's half days for teacher in service stuff or any holidays. I'm putting those in my calendar just so I know that he's going to be home on a day that probably might be a work day for me, but school might be closed, right? So that's kind of like beginning of the year. I'm doing that mapping. Then quarterly and monthly, the next kind of step down in terms of time frame, I'm always previewing what's ahead. So at the beginning of a month, like beginning of April, beginning of May, beginning of June, what I'll do is just go through my work calendar, which is where I keep everything. And I'll just kind of like get a sense for, okay, remind myself what this month is going to be like. So different parts of the year are kind of a little bit different for me in the business, right? So meaning like April and May are when I tend to do a lot of workshops for partners. I do this big 3-part series workshop for Plug and Play Tech Center. I do a couple of workshops for an innovation group that brings in entrepreneurs from the Nordic region. So I've been doing those for years. So I'm just kind of making sure that I know, okay, when are my workshops and when am I going to be traveling? If I've got conferences and events coming up, I'll be looking at what's the calendar like for our coaching clients for this month. Okay, when is the live training that we're going to be doing this month? When are the coaching calls? When do we have the one-on-one scheduled? When are we doing leadership council? Just making sure that I've got those mapped out just to get a sense for, okay, what's my month going to be like? And then the third thing I'm doing is weekly and daily planning. So weekly, meaning maybe on Sunday afternoon or first thing Monday morning. What I'll do is look at my week ahead just to see, am I a little overloaded on a day where I need to move some things around? Do I have certain client commitments that are like hard deadlines and making sure that I block out time to get those things done? I might I'll add my training and my exercise. So if I go day to day, throughout the course of a week, okay, what's my Monday look like? When am I going to train or exercise Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all the way through the weekend? Get those in my calendar. And then I'm adding buffers and time blocks to make sure I've got enough time to do all the things that I want to do. So, and then daily, I just wake up every morning. I do morning pages. Part of my morning pages looking at my day ahead and knowing what I've got ahead. So this is just kind of my routine. The other thing I'll do on a weekly basis, if you're watching this on YouTube, I do these little sheets. My wife was sort of joking yesterday. I know she jokes about it, but I know she also really appreciates it. So at the beginning of the week on a Sunday, usually what I'll do is I'll write down on a little slip of paper what are our drop off and pickup schedules for the week for my son at school? So who's going to do drop off on the mornings? Who's going to do pickup in the afternoons? Accounting for different times and days. Like Tuesdays, he does robotics club, so it's an hour later on the pickup. Wednesdays, the day ends at 1:30 instead of 3 o'clock. So making sure we're accounting for that meeting. So I might look at my calendar and go, okay, I got these meetings on Wednesday and Tuesday and Thursday, so I can't do drop off, but let me make sure I can do pickup. And I'll just write out the schedule and I'll give it to my wife. I'm like, hey, this is what I've got mapped ahead. Can you do these pickups or can you do these drop offs? And we'll do the same with dog walks. Okay, who's going to do the dog walk in the morning, in the afternoon, or the evening? Just kind of mapping that out. And that just helps us like do it once and never have to be stressed or make the assumptions like, oh, I can't do drop off because I got an early meeting and I thought you could do it. And my wife's like, oh, I actually have an early morning meeting. Now what do we do? So that's something that I'll do pretty frequently. And then, like I said, I'll also do like planning for my exercise and the training. And that goes on a daily basis. Like if I know midday, I'm going to have a 1 hour break where I'm going to go to the garage or do a run, then one of the things I do to plan or prepare is I'll make sure I've got all my gear, my running shoes, my shorts, my shirt, all that stuff, sunglasses. Now it's getting warmer. I need to put on some sunscreen. I'll put that stuff in a pile in my office and it just be sitting next to my desk so that when 11:30 rolls around, I know I've got 1 hour to get in a 5 mile run before my next meeting at 12:30 or at 1 o'clock. Then I can just right there in the office, make the change, get out the door and get that done. So it just allows me to save a little bit of time. The other thing I do, which is, I think, again, maybe a little over the top, but it's just the way I am for soccer. So I coach my son's soccer team, my club team, his club team. And one of the things I do in terms of preparation and planning is I will go and watch our opponents play their games. So, for example, this past weekend, we didn't have a game on Saturday. So, one of the things I'll do is look on the schedule and see, okay, this team or these next couple teams that we're going to be playing on the schedule, where are they playing? What time are they playing? And I will go and watch those games and I'll take some notes and figure out the formations and try to think about, okay, if this team is running a certain formation in our practice for the week ahead for that game, I'll think about, well, what can we do to counter that? Or, hey, this team has a really speedy defender on the left side. So how can I change our matchups a little bit? Now, I know it's under 12, but it is club. So it's competitive. The kids want to win. I want to help them keep improving. And so part of the work is just doing this level of preparation and planning, right? So that's kind of the way I am when it comes to planning preparation. And so let me give you a couple more examples from racing. And I want you to think about, as I'm sharing these examples, like everything that we're doing in this Go Farther podcast series, is about taking ideas that I've implemented for myself, things I've learned from other people, and sharing them so that you can either adopt them and say, wow, okay, that's a good idea. I could just plan, I could book in some time to plan the week ahead on Sunday afternoons for 30 minutes. Maybe it's just a quick, okay, I'm going to implement that right away. Or maybe it's just adapting it, saying, okay, that's a good idea. I don't like exactly the way he's doing it, but I can figure out a way to adapt that to my business or adapt that to my life or my family or something else, right? And by the way, as you're listening to this, as I've mentioned in the past, I would always appreciate it if you could, share this podcast with a friend, a couple of friends. Just, click that share episode, send them a text, send them an email. Something I do all the time if I'm out on a dog walk listening to a podcast episode. I'll flick it to a client or I'll flick it to a friend of mine and say, hey, this is a good one. You might want to check it out. Here's why. Number two, if you're just listening to the show, maybe it's the first couple episodes, I would love you to follow the show. And then thirdly, leave a review, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or SoundCloud or Spotify, whatever. It just helps us get the word out because I want to reach as many people as possible with this podcast and with this Go Farther series and with all of the concepts that we share, whether it's on the podcast or through my company at Sales Quality. And so if you could follow, and share, certainly appreciate it. Okay, so let's talk about some other specific examples from ultra marathons and other races that I do. So when it comes to this idea of plan, prepare, visualize, the visualization piece is something I find to be important to me for a couple of reasons. It's part of the planning, it's part of the preparation. And there's different people have different perspectives on visualization. There's some pretty strong magic juju people out there that say, you have to visualize success. You have to visualize yourself, whether you're, go up on stage and visualize yourself being powerful, being confident, sharing ideas. And I think there's a lot of merit to that because it does fix that image in your brain of what you want it to look like. Whether you're up on stage doing a speaking engagement or you're presenting that big sales call to a potential customer, or you're talking to an investor and you have that opportunity to go in there to, the partners to really make that pitch. I think it is important because in a way, it's the end result that we want. In that perfect world, if we can visualize what we want it to look like and how we're going to feel and how we're going to act and how we're going to respond to different situations within that meeting, certain questions we might get from the investor or certain objections we might get from the customer, or certain ways that we want the crowd to respond to us when we're up on stage. I think that's really important because if we don't know exactly what we want that end result to look like, it's kind of hard to know how to get there, what planning and preparation we need to get to. It's hard to get that clarity and control and the confidence that we want if we don't know what the end result looks like. And so for me, whenever I've got big races, one of the things I do is visualize myself running on the course. So for the Western States race, for example, I've run the entire course as part of training. And so at night, when I'm going to bed, as a way to help myself relax and get to sleep, one of the things I'll do is just pick a part of the course, whether it's a big hill that I'm going to climb, or maybe it's a section where I know there's some nice downhill. I will visualize myself on that course. I'll imagine going up the hill. I'll remember the twists and turns of the course. I'll remember certain parts that are going to be hot and exposed or parts that are going to be shaded. And just imagine what that feels like when I'm going through that course because it helps me rehearse what it's going to be like when I'm on that section of the course. I'll do the same thing like in terms of preparation with when I was doing triathlons. Now, triathlons, of course, are swim, bike, and run. And there's a couple of other parts of triathlons that are really critical. One is nutrition, like how are we getting enough salt and hydration? How do you eat when you're on the bike, or how do you make sure you get enough calories while you're running? Those things are important. But what we call the transitions. So when you get out of the water from the swim, you're obviously dripping wet. You might be a little bit cold just because you've been in the water, even though you've been moving. You've got this wetsuit on in most cases. You got to strip the wetsuit off, and then you got to change into your cycling gear, right? You've got to get socks on. You got to get your feet dry. You've got to make sure you get all your gear on, your helmet, all of those things. And there's a real process to doing this. And so one of the things that I used to do in our triathlon we used to do is we used to practice transitions because there are many minutes that if you don't have a good transition, you could just be wasting in the transition area. If you come out of the swim and you don't have a plan for how you're going to get your wetsuit off, how you're going to get your feet dry, how you're going to get your socks on, your shoes, make sure that you got your helmet on, all of that stuff and get out quickly, you could literally waste a lot of minutes doing that. And the same with the bike. You're coming off the bike, your legs are going to be spent, your butt hurts from sitting in the saddle for a long time. Maybe your back is cranky because you've been leaning over on your time trial bike for a long time. Like the same thing, you got to get off the bike, you got to get your running gear on, ready to go. And so those transitions you can really eat up a lot of minutes. So that's something else that as part of preparation, I used to practice transitions. When I was training, I would do workouts that were cycling and running. So if I did cycling, like one of the workouts I'd do like a really hard 10 miles bike, come home and then do a 1 mile sprint run. And then I do another 10-mile bike and then come back and do a 1 mile sprint run. So it was a chance for me to practice those transitions as part of the workout. The same thing with aid stations, right? One of the things I do with my aid station bags is for every aid station bag, I know which bag goes at which aid station along the way. So if I'm doing a 100-mile race, there might be an aid station bag for mile 26 and another one for mile 48 and another one for mile 76. And so in those aid station bags that I'm leaving for myself, I will also write down a checklist and I'll say, okay, when you open this bag, these are the things to do in order. That way I don't have to think about it when I get there. I don't have to remember what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'll even say, like, grab these, in my checklist, it'll say, swap out your tailwind packets, fill it up with water. Make sure you change socks at this aid station. Because I'm not going to remember if I'm tired. I've been running for 76 miles. It could have been 20 plus hours. You're not going to remember, like, why did I put these socks in here? So it's just important to remember to doing that. Other things I would do with Preparing for races, I write out a race manual for myself. So if I have pacers, I write a pacer's manual and I write that stuff out. I did this for Western States. I had like a 10-page guide for how to pace me, things that we're doing, times that we should be checking, things to do or don't do when you're pacing me. In preparation for the race, I worked with a coach. There's a book called Calm the F Down, and it's called The Brave Athlete. And the authors are Simon Marshall and Leslie Patterson. And so going into prior to Uberman and prior to the Tahoe 200 race, I booked some time to work with these coaches, and it's about mindset. And one of the things that they had me do was write down 50 things that could go wrong in these races. And, if you're on the trail, it could be everything from what happens if you see a bear in the middle of the night, or what happens if you see a rattlesnake, or what happens if your aid bag gets lost, what happens if you cramp, what happens if you're injured, what happens if you're feeling a blister. Like there's so many things that could go wrong. So they told me to write all that stuff down and then write down what I would do in response to that situation popping up. Now, the chances of all 50 things going wrong is pretty small. You're probably going to have three, four, five things go wrong. You're probably going to get some kind of blister. You're probably going to have a situation where your stomach's not right. You're probably going to have a situation where you're a little bit behind, or it's a little too hot, or it's a little too cold. And just knowing that you've written that down and you have a plan to handle that situation when things do go a little wrong gives you a lot more confidence, gives you a lot more control on what to do. It gives you a lot more clarity. Hey, if I'm in this situation, it's okay because I've planned for this. And if my stomach's not right and I'm having a hard time keeping my food down, it's okay because I've packed some Pepto-Bismol tablets in my backpack. So I can just grab those, pop those into my stomach and see if that helps. I can take a little more salt. I can make sure when I get to the next aid station, I tell the aid station person, like, my stomach's not right, as opposed to keeping it to myself. These are all things that I'm doing in preparation for a race, so that if my stomach's not right, I've got some options to try to alleviate that situation. A couple last things here on the race thing is when I was doing Uberman, which included, a long bike ride. One of the things I did is I packed two helmets and I packed two bikes. Now I packed two bikes because they're part of that course was going to be better for road bike, or if you're doing like a long climb, or part of the section is just not good for a time trial bike. Maybe it's really bumpy or some other reason. Right. So I packed two bikes because I wanted to be able to ride some road bike, and then other stretches that were long and straight and in the desert, I want to get on the time trial bike and take advantage of those. But then the two helmets I packed, one is a regular kind of, riding helmet. The other was an aero helmet. Now I packed them because when I'm on the time trial bike, getting the aero helmet does save with energy, the amount of energy you're spending. But it turns out when I went to put that time trial bike helmet on, the strap broke. And I was like, oh man, the strap broke. Then I thought, oh man, it's not that big of a deal because I have another helmet. Now, had I not had a second helmet, now I'm really in trouble. Like, what am I going to do if I'm in the middle of the desert and I'm supposed to be getting on a bike and I'm supposed to be riding 50 miles over the next 3 hours and I don't have a helmet? Like, that'd be kind of crazy to get out there without a helmet. But because I had a backup, it was fine. So it's just ways of thinking about planning, preparation, like preparing for the worst case so that if something does go wrong, it's not that big a deal. You've got a solution in place. So those are just all different little examples from personal and race life that I've done. So let's transition to some work examples. And then I've got 5 strategies here I want to share with you that I think will help you on this plan, prepare, visualize piece to help you personally do more, be happy, and surprise yourself. So, first thing on the work side of things, one of the things that I've instituted with our clients is what we call account planning meetings, meaning that when you have that large account, you can't necessarily do this with every single account in your pipeline. Let's say you take your top 10 or take your top 5 accounts that you're really working, they're in the middle of your pipeline or they're early stage, they're developing. One of the things that we do is what we call an account planning meeting. And in the account planning meeting, we bring in all of the different people on the company that are working on that account. So it could mean, for example, the CEO and the founder might be leading the account work. That person might have a couple of folks helping them, whether it's an engineer or if it's a slightly more developed company, maybe they got a sales engineer. Maybe you've got an account executive that's taking a role. Like no one person is working this account on their own, right? So the first thing we do is we sort of take stock of, okay, what has everyone learned on this account over the course of the first couple of weeks, the first couple of months of working this account? And then the second thing we do is we build out key results and KPIs for that account. So for example, let's say you're selling to Wells Fargo and Wells Fargo is a deal that you qualified it, it's an important deal, you're going to be working this account, there's a path to getting this thing converted. But you also know it could take another 6 months, it could take another 9 months to get that thing over the line to conversion. Well, one of the things we want to do in the short run as a way to plan and prepare is identify in, say, quarter two, if it's April, May, and June, and we're doing a quarterly meeting to plan that account, what's the optimal outcome? What's the key result we want to get to by the end of the quarter? So if we say by the end of the year, by Q4, we want to have this account converted and paid into an annual contract. Well, in the next 3 months, then perhaps a key result would be to get a pilot program, paid pilot, verbally accepted and in contract to do a paid pilot that would run over the summer months. And the reason that's important is because we want to get the pilot should be paid. Secondly, we want to make sure that they have a chance to use the software, use the platform before the budget season that kicks up in Q3, so they can see for themselves, like, yeah, this is a solution that we want to buy, we want to implement for next year. And that puts us on a path to get a contract signed by the end of the year. So the key result in the shorter run is to make sure we get a paid pilot, at least verbally committed, and a statement of work or a work contract in place by the end of the quarter so that we can run that pilot over the summer months. That's a key result. Then we peel it back even more and say, well, what's a KPI, or what are a couple KPIs that in April, for example, that we know we need to get a couple things done in April that will enable us to get the verbal pilot approved by the end of June. And maybe those KPIs are like by the end of April, we need to have an on-site meeting. We need to have met with technical buyers. We need to have met with the economic buyer to make sure that we're all on track in terms of what's the key problem they're trying to solve, what's the strategic priority that they're trying to deal with, and introduce the concept of a paid pilot so that we can start to map out a work plan of what a paid pilot might look like, kind of a mini sale by the end of June to get to that key result. So I think it's really critical. I don't think enough people out there, at least when we work with clients, this is a pretty new concept for them to think about. Like, how do we plan the account? How do we use this concept of OKRs, objectives and key results, as part of an account plan? It's a way to help you plan. It's a way to help you prioritize. It's a way to help you prepare. It's a way to help you visualize what needs to happen. And it also gives you a way to put numbers down and hold the team accountable to say, look, like if we want to get to a verbal commitment of a paid pilot by the end of June, that means, Bill, you're the account manager. Bill, you need to make sure that we have a meeting with the economic buyer in the next 2 weeks. Because if we don't get the meeting with the economic buyer, we can't qualify and requalify the key problem and the strategic priority that this person has, and that there's budget available for the paid pilot. Sarah, you need to work, you're the head of engineering. You need to work with their technical people to take a look at their APIs or have them look at our documentation so that when we go to the economic buyer, we can tell them that we know that a pilot is feasible because we've talked to the tech team and they're excited about working with our product, right? Those are KPIs that need to be done in April, and you two are accountable for making those things happen. So that's just one quick strategy is that when you take your top 5 or top 10 accounts, do that account planning, give yourself some key results and some KPIs in the short run, because that will help you avoid that situation where it's like, oh, the next meeting, the next meeting, the next meeting. You need to know where it's all going. So that's number 1. Work example number 2 is doing stand-ups and meeting prep. So prior to an individual meeting, particularly if it's a big meeting, one of the things that's important to do is look at what are the key outcomes that we want to have for that particular meeting. What are some key questions we need to be asking to get to those key outcomes? Like what questions do we have to prepare to ask the prospect? What content do we need to prep for that meeting? And casting, like who's going to be responsible for what? If I'm the CEO, yes, I might be running the call, but I also want to have my solutions engineer, also want to have my account executive, like who's going to ask which questions? What are the roles and responsibilities for that meeting, right? So that's something else that we'll do. So one of the things I did as an example, when I was the head of sales and the COO over at Altos Research, which is years ago, we hired a couple of account executives that were handling some of the larger accounts. And both of the account executives we hired were relatively junior. They hadn't worked a ton of big enterprise accounts. So there was a lot of training and development that had to go into helping them with these accounts. And I remember one meeting in particular with one of our account reps, a guy named Jeff, and we took an hour before one of the meetings that he had scheduled with a key account that we were working. This is a pretty good sized deal. I think it was like a 50 or 60K annualized contract. So for him, it was like one of the larger deals that he had worked. And for the company, that was a good sized deal. We wanted to make sure we did everything we could to convert that, of course. And so one of the things we did an hour before the meeting is we went to the conference room and I took the whiteboard and we just mapped out how this meeting could go. So how are we going to introduce the meeting? Like, how are we going to introduce the agenda? Who is going to be on that meeting on their side? Who's confirmed? And okay, so if these people, let's say that their economic buyer shows up to the meeting as scheduled, what are some things, what are some questions we need to make sure to ask that economic buyer to verify budget, or verify this is a key priority? And then starting to create an if then scenario. Well, if they say this, then we will do that. If they say this other thing, then this is the path that we're going to take. And so we ended up sketching out this entire flow chart of how the meeting was going to go. And then we ran the meeting from the conference room. So we had this meeting map that we could say, okay, if this thing comes up, then we know to go this certain route, or we know to show this certain example. We know to talk about this case study, right? So that was something just as preparation for a big meeting that allowed him to see how he should be preparing and allowed us to execute better in that meeting. So a third example that's really helpful is using flowchart software yourself or building out slides. So I do this a lot, both for internal meetings and I do it for external meetings that I'm having. There's a couple, I mean, obviously there's a lot of great flowchart software out there. I've used Lucid Charts. I know Whimsical's out there. There's many others. One of the things I did from a process standpoint for one of my clients is they're pretty new in their industry, of course, but they're really specific and focused on a certain problem that they solve. And the good news is they're getting some inbound leads because of the specificity of their solution to the market that they're selling to. The challenge that they have is they don't have a specific process for how to handle an inbound lead. Like they've got somebody that's really good at doing lead gen and lead development, but there's not a really clear process internally, which is, of course, one of the reasons why people hire us here at Sales Quality. So one of the things I did with them is using Lucid Charts, I mapped out an if then. So inbound lead comes in. What are the first three things that should happen? Acknowledge receipt, pick up the phone, send a LinkedIn, go over to the LinkedIn profile. And then once you're at the LinkedIn profile, what are the three things you should be doing on that profile? And then after you do that initial follow-up, then what is the next round of things you should be doing as part of your account research? What do you do with the account research information? Where does it go in the CRM? What do you share with the rest of the team? So just creating this big if then and using a flow chart as a way to visualize all the things that need to be happening. So it's not just based on memory or checklists, actually giving somebody like a visual map of how all of these things relate to each other. So that's another example of like ways that I've been implementing this idea of planning and preparing and visualizing. The last thing that good example when it comes to planning and preparing and visualizing is when you are going to an on-site to do a meeting. And so this is something that I did, and a really good example of this is when I was at Blend Labs, we had one of those, air quotes, big meetings with the key executives. We had the chief operating officer, we had a chief of staff, we had a lending person, we had an operations person, and we're all going to be in this conference room in San Francisco to do the big meeting, the big presentation. And so one of the things that I did, and this is something, again, like I've got checklists around this and I share this with clients all the time, is a few days before that big meeting, I always make it a point to send an email to the executive assistant to either request a call or ask if I can send a list of questions to prepare for that onsite. So for example, one of the things I'll do is ask about internet access and say like, obviously, do you have Wi-Fi or do I have to hook in to a LAN? I'm just dating myself a little bit, but there were days where you'd have to hook into a LAN cord. If it's Wi-Fi, do I have to request permission and get an account set up? Or is it just Wi-Fi I can hook into? Because if you're selling at a bank, right, you may not be able to just show up and hook into their internet Wi-Fi network. And so I found this at Freddie Mac. I learned the hard way for another meeting I was doing. I flew all the way to DC, went to do this huge meeting with Freddie Mac, and we're like 10 minutes before the meeting's supposed to start. And I go to hook into the Wi-Fi and it says, request system access from administrator. I'm like, well, how the hell do I do that? Now, fortunately, the main project sponsor was with me as we were preparing for this meeting. He's like, oh, I know how to handle this. I'm going to go get you a Wi-Fi code. And we took care of it. But you're not always that lucky to have that person there. So something as simple as asking about internet access, asking about the room setup. What's the room like? Is it a big room with one conference room? Is it more of a classroom setting? Is it stadium structure? I've been at Wells Fargo in their corporate office in Des Moines. They had this huge room with stadium seating. It was almost like a giant graduate school MBA classroom. Understanding what adapters might be needed, for example. Not all banks, for example, are Mac friendly. So do they have the adapters that are necessary? You might be expecting to show up and hook up to Apple TV, but they don't have Apple TV. You've got to figure out what those monitors are like. What are the screens going to be like? What are the lights going to be? And so I had this checklist of things and I ran through it with the executive assistant at First Republic. And she sent me back an email at one point in our conversation. She said, I have never worked with somebody that's been so organized and so prepared for a meeting. And that just put a big smile on my face because that's exactly what I want. It not only helps me prepare for that meeting to make sure that it's successful and remove any variables away that might harpoon the meeting, but it also shows well because that executive assistant is going to go back to those executives and say, hey, just so you know, like this guy Scott over at Blend, man, like this dude is really well prepared. He's asked me about all of those things, and that's going to put a smile to their face, right? So these are just different examples where I've implemented this idea of planning and preparing and visualizing. So finally, I want to wrap up here with a few strategies on this concept. I know I've been going pretty hard, pretty fast here, so lots of stuff. Like I said, it's one of my favorite topics. So 5 strategies. Number 1, block time to plan and prepare. Block time to plan and prepare. So again, like I do annual, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily planning. Make sure that you start to figure out good times for you to do your planning. For me, it could be a Sunday afternoon or a Monday morning to do my weekly. Every day when I'm doing my morning pages is my kind of my daily prep. End of the month, I'll look at, if it's end of April, I'll be looking ahead to, okay, what's going to be happening in May? What are some things that are coming up with travel and workshops and conferences and soccer and jiu-jitsu and training and stuff going on with my wife and stuff going on with my son, right? Just making sure that I've got all that stuff squared away. So just make sure you're blocking time to plan and prepare. You'd be surprised how quickly, 15 minutes of preparation at the beginning of the day or 30 minutes of preparation before the beginning of the week makes a huge, huge difference. Even preparing for this podcast, as an example, like this is a Monday morning time block that I have where I will sit and plan and prepare for the content. So much so that I've got these little sheets of paper that I use and I've actually do it twice. So I do my draft. I'm showing you on, if you're watching this on YouTube, I do a first draft of all of the content, all of the ideas, all of the structure that I think I want to follow. And then once I got the draft down, then I rewrite it into more organized notes that's a little bit more legible and easy for me to follow. So again, it's just a matter of making that time, blocking out that time to execute so that I can deliver content in a way to you that's useful and makes me feel proud of the work that gets done, right? So that's number 1, blocking out time to plan and prepare. Number 2, write down your plan. Write down your plan. It's not enough to say to yourself like, "Oh, when I get to this page, I'm going to say this," and if they ask this question, I'm going to say that. Like, write it down. Write down your plan. Write down the sketch of how this meeting is going to go. Write down the questions that you're going to ask. All of that in preparation. Got to write it down. A couple things will happen. When you write it down, it forces you to go a little slower because you're writing it down, not just thinking it. And then as you're writing it down, more things will come to mind. Your brain will naturally think of more things that are relevant to this because you're taking the time to thoughtfully write it down. And so for me, that's why I have a first draft of notes because I'll end up with some extra side notes in the columns or in the margins. And then I want to bring all that together to the actual plan that I want to implement. One of the things I've done this year in particular that's been really helpful is for annual projects that I'm working on. So I've got like 5 or 6 kind of big projects. So a couple are big projects with a couple of clients that I'm doing some embedded work with. I've got my plan with Sales Qualia. I've got my plan around racing. I've got my personal stuff that I'm doing. And I read a book at the end of last year, beginning of this year, called The One Thing. It's called The One Thing. It's by Gary Keller from Keller Williams Realty. And one of the things that he talks about is writing down your plan in different timelines. So you have what he calls your someday goals. Those are like your big goals that you want to have someday. And then what are your 5 year outcomes relative to the someday goal? Then what is the 1 year outcome relative to the 5 year plan that's going to get you to the someday goal? And then what's your 1 month plan that's going to roll into the 1 year, to the 5 year, to the someday? Then your 1 week plan, and then your right now, your today plan. What are the 3 things I can do today? And so I've actually done that with these 5 big projects. And then each month I'm revisiting those and looking at what are the things I need to be doing this month as a way to get to where I want to be by the end of the year, which is going to help me get to that 5 year outcome, which is going to help me get to that someday goal. And then every day when I'm doing my morning journal, I come up with the actions that day or that week that need to be done in order to get to the 1 month outcome. And I just find by writing it down, it helps me keep a log of progress. It helps me figure out exactly what needs to be done. It gives me a checklist of things I need to add to my calendar, making sure that I'm making space and time to work on these things. And most of all, it just helps you formulate, get your ideas down. Sometimes, when I'm writing anything, I've heard it that sometimes you have to write stuff down to know what you're thinking about. Like we have concepts in our mind, and sometimes they're ambiguous or nebulous, but when you write it down, like it forces you to formulate that into a concrete plan for yourself and for other people to read. So by writing it down, it forces you to figure out what you're thinking about. So that's strategy number 2 is write it down. Number 3, communicate. Communicate with the team, communicate with the people around you. With me and my wife, it's communicating about drop-offs and pickups and what the week's going to be like, or communicating on the weekend. Like, what are your plans for this weekend? What date are you planning to go to the barn? When do we have soccer practice? When do I want to do some training? When do I want to go to a jiu-jitsu class? Who is going to make sure that we spend a little extra time with Benjamin to get him out of the house and away from Fortnite? Does Benjamin have a Fortnite tournament? He's been doing these tournaments on Fortnite and he's really excited about them and he's improving every time. I'm asking him like, hey, do you have a tournament this weekend? Because, okay, cool. If you want to do this Fortnite tournament, I'm good with that. I want to support that. But you need to let me know when it is, because if you're planning to do a tournament and it starts at 5 p.m., but we were also planning to go to a friend's house for dinner, like we got to talk about those things. So communicating with the people around you is really important because we can have a plan. And oftentimes I will make a plan and then I'll go to my wife and say, like, here's the plan for the week, or here's the plan for the weekend. And she's like, oh, well, actually, I was thinking about doing this or that, or I was thinking we should have dinner with friends. I was like, okay, cool. Well, let's just adjust. Let's adjust the plan. And it's the same with your team at work. Like you can come up with all these plans yourself, but it can't just be you coming up with these plans and then just pushing it down, because your team probably also has their own plans. They might have their own schedules. They might have meetings on the calendar that you didn't know about. They might have travel. They might be planning to take a day off on Friday and they just haven't communicated that with you. Or maybe, you forgot that this week was their kids' spring break and they were going to have to spend a little extra time at home because they don't have camp set up or whatever that is, right? So communicating with your team is super important to be able to make sure everybody's on board with the plan, everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are, and most importantly, to make sure that the plan of everybody is one that everybody has buy-in for, so you can make those adjustments and make sure that everybody has some ownership and accountability in that plan. So that's strategy number 3 is communicate. Number 4 is accepting, acknowledging, and acting when the plan goes off kilter, right? So we have the plans. There's a reason that there's the saying, the best laid plans of mice and men, right? So we make the plan, and sometimes it's as soon as the first day into a 30-day plan, or the first sales call, or the first 5 minutes of a meeting. You thought the meeting was going to go a certain way, and that key executive you didn't expect to show up shows up and starts firing questions, or tells you like, look, I can only stay for the first 10 minutes. And you were hoping they were going to be able to stay for the whole hour. Well, what are you going to do in those situations? Right? You can't necessarily change reality, but what you can do is accept the fact that this is happening, acknowledge that you've got to make an adjustment, and then act accordingly to it. So being flexible and being present and being willing to make a change. Part of the reason that you're doing the planning is so that if things go off schedule or go off kilter, that you've got the ability to be adaptable and to be flexible and to be resourceful. So that's strategy number 4 is just know that sometimes, of course, the plan doesn't go according to nothing goes according to plan. And how do you accept that? How do you acknowledge it? How do you act accordingly? And then finally, and this is just something that I've experienced, I'll give you a couple examples of this. I read a book years and years ago by a guy named Harvey Mackay. The name of the book is How to Swim with the Sharks and Stay Alive, something like that. How to Swim with the Sharks and Remain Alive. I'm butchering the title a little bit. So Harvey Mackay wrote this book. I read it probably 25 years ago at this point. And one of the things that has always stuck with me is one of his chapters, which is if you can buy your way out of a problem, you don't have a problem. If you can buy your way out of a problem, you don't have a problem. I've thought about this because a couple of examples where I've used this. I remember many, many years ago when I was first out of college, even before I started working at Prentice Hall as a publishing rep, I was working a short tenure with a cabinet door manufacturing company. So the company is called Decorative Specialties, and they manufactured cabinet doors for cabinet makers. It turns out it's a very specialized thing to make a cabinet door relative to the rest of the boxes. And so they specialized in this and they built a business that was doing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And we were at a conference in Los Angeles, and I was with one of the more senior account managers, and we were taking a client, these two guys, out to an LA Dodgers game at night. So we had a conference during the day, and we're like, "Hey, we got 4 tickets to the Dodgers game. We'd love to take you out to the game. We had really good seats." And so we're driving to the game, and we didn't have a ton of time before the game, so we had to find a place to park. So I happened to be driving, and we drove over to this parking lot, and the guy that was working the lot said, "Oh, this is the reserve parking for folks. Like you have to have reserve this or some kind of special pass." And I looked at him and I looked at the guy. I was like, "Well, how much to reserve?" And he just said $50. So I took $50 out of my wallet. I had cash and I gave him $50. And he's like, "Here you go." Now paying $50 for parking now it might seem kind of normal because that's what you end up paying a lot of times for these venues. But back then, like that was kind of a lot of cash. But I had the clients in the back seat. I had my senior colleague with me in the front seat. And I was like, the game first pitch is in like 20 minutes. We hadn't even parked. I'm like, if you can buy your way out of a problem, you don't have a problem, right? Some other things you might do think about is like spending a little extra to give yourself some comfort. So, for example, let's say you got a big meeting and you have to fly to Las Vegas or you have to fly to Chicago, and the meeting is at 2 in the afternoon. And you're like, okay, well, look, I can catch a morning flight. I'll get up early. I'll get to 6 a.m. I'll get to Chicago by 9, and then I'll get over to the place. And sure, you could do that. And also, it's a way to save a little money on a hotel room, or you could give yourself some extra time and just fly the night before and pay for the hotel room. It's kind of worth it, right? Because what happens, of course, if your flight's delayed? Now the meeting is busted. So give yourself a little buffer there by preventing a problem in the first place. Because even if your flight for whatever reason get canceled the night before, then you can catch the one in the morning, right? Be willing to change your flight. I remember one time I was at Blend and I was supposed to catch a flight out of Sacramento because I live close to the airport, all kinds of weird weather in Sacramento. And there's not as many flights out of Sacramento to some of the big cities like Chicago and Dallas and other places. You can catch them, but they're just not as frequent. And for whatever reason, my flight out of Sacramento was getting canceled. And I needed to be I can't remember where I needed to be, whether Chicago or Dallas or something like that. And so the first thing I did as I looked at, okay, what other flights are available from Oakland and San Francisco? Now that's a much bigger drive. It's like, could be 2 hours to get to SFO from where I live. But I looked up a flight. There was a flight leaving in about 3 or 4 hours from San Francisco. And basically I went and turned and bought a ticket for that flight, which cost me, at the time, it was like $1,000 for this ticket because it was last second, last minute. And then I get in the car and I drive and I go to SFO, make sure I get on that flight to get to the place I needed to go. And then afterwards, when I was doing my expense report, I just told Aaron, the CFO, I'm like, look, man, here's what happened. I could either miss my flight because it got canceled, or I could spend $1,000 last minute. And now we're a startup. That's a lot of money. You don't want to just spend $1,000 on a ticket if you can avoid it. But the net result or the key outcome, of course, was looking at a client that's going to be 6 digits or 7 digits down the road. So if you can buy your way out of a problem, you don't have a problem. So those are my 5 strategies: block time, write down your plan, communicate with your team, accept, acknowledge, and act. And if you can buy your way out of a problem, you'll have a problem. That will help you plan, prioritize, and visualize your success. So one last time, I'll ask you to please like, please share, please subscribe, follow the show. Please share this with a friend or 10, leave us a review. Please do follow the show. Absolutely love it when you're liking the comments on LinkedIn posts or other places where you're hearing about this podcast. It helps us get the word out to the rest of the audience. Because end of the day, the whole goal of this podcast series, the Go Farther podcast series, is to help you do more, be happy, and surprise yourself. Go farther.